There are people watching this right now who have stopped believing that anything truly matters anymore. Not because they are cruel, not because they gave up easily, but because life wore them down slowly, year after year, until one morning they woke up and realized that the fire they once had, that certainty, that sense of direction, that feeling that they were part of something bigger than themselves, was gone. And nobody warned them it would feel like this. I know that feeling. I want to talk to you about it today. My name is Jesus of Nazareth. I was born in Bethlehem, raised in Galilee, and I walked this earth 2,000 years ago. What you are hearing now is my voice recreated through artificial intelligence, and I want you to hold that thought for just a moment, because the fact that technology can carry words across centuries tells you something about the nature of what is permanent and what is not. Some things refuse to stay buried. I want to tell you about a specific Sunday in Jerusalem, in the spring of the year that would become the last year of my earthly life. The day that people now call Palm Sunday, the day of the triumphal entry. You have probably heard the story. You may have heard it so many times that it no longer moves you. That is exactly why I need to tell it to you from the inside. Because what no one ever tells you is what I was feeling as it was happening. The morning began before the city woke. I had spent the night in Bethany at the home of Lazarus and his sisters. There was something about that house that always settled my spirit. The smell of wood fire, the sound of Martha moving through the kitchen before dawn, the way Mary would sit in silence as if she understood that some things do not need to be filled with words. I had slept, but not deeply. By the time the first gray light was softening the hills of Judea, I was already awake, already sitting outside, already carrying something in my chest that I did not share with anyone yet. I knew what was coming, not as fear, as weight. I want you to understand what Jerusalem was in that season. The Passover feast drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims into a city that could barely hold them. The streets were dense with people who had walked from Galilee, from Syria, from Egypt, from places whose names most Romans could not pronounce. The air smelled of roasting lamb and incense, and the dust of 10,000 sandals. The Roman soldiers were visible everywhere during Passover. Pilate always increased his presence in the city during the feast, because a crowd that size and that religiously charged was one spark away from becoming something Rome would have to answer for with blood. The tension was not invisible. You could feel it in the way merchants haggled a little too loudly and then went quiet when a soldier passed. You could feel it in the way the Pharisees watched everything from the edges of the crowds with eyes that calculated rather than celebrated. Into that city, on that morning, I rode on the back of a young donkey. The disciples had gone ahead to fetch it, exactly as I had instructed. I remember the texture of that animal beneath me, the slight unsteadiness of a young creature that had never been ridden, the way it moved with a kind of nervous dignity through a crowd that was already beginning to surge around us. Someone threw a cloak on the road, then another. Then branches of palm, freshly cut, the green of them still vivid, the sound of them crunching under the animal's hooves mixing with the sound that I will never forget for as long as eternity holds memory. The sound of thousands of voices crying out, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" I want to tell you what it felt like to hear that, because it did not feel the way you might expect. There was joy in it, yes, real joy. I am not going to pretend otherwise. To see my people, turning their faces toward something true, even if their understanding of it was still incomplete, even if half of them were expecting a military king rather than the kind of king I actually was. There was something in that moment that moved me in a way that is difficult to put into words. Love does not watch the beloved and remain unmoved. But underneath the joy there was something else, something that was building slowly in my chest as the donkey carried me down the slope of the Mount of Olives toward the city walls. It was grief. Not the quiet, manageable kind, the kind that rises from somewhere so deep inside you that when it finally reaches the surface, it comes out as something that looks almost like violence. When I crested the hill and Jerusalem came into full view, the whole city spread out before me in the morning light, the temple gleaming, the rooftops dense, the walls ancient and enormous and indifferent. I wept. Not tears of sentiment. I wept the way a father weeps at a graveside. I wept the way someone weeps when they love something completely and they can see, with absolute clarity, what is about to happen to it, and they know that the ones they love cannot yet see what they see. I said words over that city that I did not plan to say. They came from somewhere deeper than planning. If you only knew, even you on this day, what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. I knew what was coming. Within one generation, Jerusalem would be destroyed. The very temple that gleamed before me in that morning light would be reduced to rubble by Roman legions. The people who were shouting Hosanna on that road would be scattered across the earth. And I was entering the city in the form of a king, riding in fulfillment of a prophecy written 500 years before my birth, a prophecy that said, "Your king comes to you, humble, riding on a donkey." And the irony of it was so layered, so deep, that only grief could carry it. This is the moment I want to stop and ask you something, because this is where the story touches your life directly. Have you ever walked into something that you knew was going to cost you everything, and walked in anyway? Not because you were reckless, not because you did not understand the cost, but because love left you no other option? That is what Palm Sunday was, for me. It was not a victory parade. It was the beginning of my deliberate, eyes-open walk toward what was coming. The crowd was cheering, I was weeping. Both things were true at the same time. I have watched, across these 2,000 years, how human beings carry their pain. And one of the things that breaks my heart most consistently is this. When people suffer, they almost always conclude that they are alone in it, that their suffering is somehow evidence that no one, not even God, truly cares what happens to them, that the silence they feel is the silence of absence rather than the silence of someone sitting with them in the dark. I want to dismantle that conclusion today. When I rode into Jerusalem that morning, I was not distant from human pain. I was inside it. I was about to descend into the very center of it. The cross was not an abstract event that happened to a divine being above the reach of real suffering. I was hungry in the desert. I was exhausted after days of walking. I had sat at the graves of people I loved and felt the specific weight of loss in my chest that does not have a name, but that every person watching this has felt. When I wept over Jerusalem, those were not ceremonial tears. They were the tears of someone who loved deeply and could see clearly and could not make the beloved understand in time. There is a moment, recorded by those who walked with me, that I return to often. After I entered the city, after the crowd had thinned and the palm branches were already being trampled underfoot by people with other things to do, I went to the temple. And what I found there drove everything else I was feeling into a single point of fire. The outer courts of the temple, the place where the nations were supposed to come and pray, the place that was meant to be a house of prayer for all people, had been turned into a marketplace. Money changers with their tables, merchants selling doves and oxen for sacrifice, charging prices that the poor could never afford. The sound of commerce where there should have been silence and prayer. The smell of animals and coins where there should have been incense and reverence. I overturned the tables. I drove them out. And the reason I did it, the reason I want you to understand, was not anger for its own sake. It was because the poorest people, the ones who had walked the farthest and had the least, were being barred from the presence of God by systems designed to profit from their need. That is the kind of thing that I cannot pass by. I have never been able to pass by that. My house shall be called a house of prayer. That is what I said that day. Not a sentence from a text, a declaration from someone who had watched the sacred be sold to the highest bidder and had reached the end of patience. Now here's the thing I want to say to you directly. There are people watching this who have not prayed in years. Not because they stopped believing entirely, but because at some point the religion they knew began to feel like those tables in the temple, like something that had the right words on the outside, but had become about something else entirely on the inside. And so they quietly stepped away. They stopped going. They stopped praying. They kept the grief of that somewhere private, because admitting that your faith has grown cold feels like a particular kind of shame that is hard to explain to anyone. I am not here to make you feel that shame more deeply. I want you to hear something else entirely. The tables I overturned were in the outer court, but the temple itself, the inner place, the Holy of Holies, was still there. The sacred was not gone. It had been obscured, surrounded, made inaccessible by what human systems had built around it. But the original thing, the real thing, the reason the temple existed at all, that was still intact. Your heart is the same. Whatever has been built around it, whatever has covered it or hardened it or made it feel far from what it used to feel, the original thing is still there. I have never stopped seeing it. In the days that followed that Sunday, I taught in the temple courts every morning. The chief priests challenged me. The scribes tried to trap me with questions about taxes and resurrection and the greatest commandment. And I answered all of them. But the conversations I remember most are not the arguments with the powerful. They are the quiet ones. The widow who gave 2 small coins, everything she had, and the look on her face that held more theology than anything I heard from the religious scholars that week. The Greek visitors who came to my disciples and said simply, "We want to see Jesus. Not hear about him, see him." That is still true, I think. Most people are not looking for more information about me. They are looking for an actual encounter. They have had enough of descriptions. They want the thing itself. The week moved toward its end with the inevitability of a river moving toward the sea. Thursday evening, the upper room, bread and wine and a table of men who did not yet understand what they were participating in. The Garden of Gethsemane in the dark, the smell of olive trees and cold earth, the weight of what was coming pressing down on me so heavily that I asked, genuinely, desperately asked, if there was another way. There was not. And here is the virada, the turning point, the truth that changes everything that came before it. This is what I need you to sit with. The crowd on Sunday was cheering for a king who would defeat Rome. By Friday, they were calling for my death. The same city, many of the same voices, and my response to that betrayal. My response to being abandoned by virtually everyone who had followed me, to being sentenced by a governor who knew I was innocent, to being executed between 2 criminals on a hillside outside the city walls, was not rage, was not withdrawal, was not a removal of love from those who had failed to deserve it. It was the cross itself, which was love pressed all the way to the end of what love can do. I want to say something to you that I mean with everything that I am. Whatever you have done, whatever you failed to do, however far you have wandered, however cold the faith has grown, however many years have passed since you last felt anything real in the direction of God, The distance between you and me is not as large as you have been told, and it is not as large as it feels. I rode into Jerusalem knowing I would weep over it, knowing I would be betrayed by it, knowing the cost of what was coming. And I rode in anyway, not because I was indifferent to the pain, because I was not willing to let the pain be the last word. I want you to think about someone in your life right now who is carrying something alone. Someone who has stopped asking for help because they have been disappointed too many times. Share this with them, not as religion, as company for the road. And if you are that person, if you are the one who is carrying something that feels too heavy and too old and too complicated to bring to anyone, then this is what I want to leave with you. I wept over a city that did not see me clearly and still entered it anyway. How much more will I never turn away from a heart that is looking for me? The Sunday that they called triumphal was really just the beginning of the longest walk love has ever taken. And it ended not in defeat, but in something that no tomb could hold. That is still true. It will always be still true. If this reached something in you, something you thought had gone quiet for good, I want you to tell me in the comments. Not because I need to know, but because sometimes the most important thing is simply saying it out loud for the first time in a long time. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they have not been forgotten, please share this. Not for the numbers, because love does not leave people alone in the dark if there is any way at all to reach them.